Hi there and welcome back to the channel and welcome to an indoor video. And I guess with another lockdown on the way this week here in England, we'd all better get used to a few more indoor videos again. Really frustrating. But today I wanted to talk about depth of field and what the ideal range of depth of field controls for landscape photography might be. First things first, so that we all know what we're talking about. Depth of field is defined as the distance between the nearest and the furthest objects that are in an acceptably sharp focus in an image. Now that definition is from Wikipedia, so it might not be the most technical definition, but it'll do for the purposes of this discussion. Now when I bought a camera first, 15 or 16 years ago, I was photographing mostly musicians and bands in mostly small venues in mostly low light, and I needed to understand how to get as much light into the camera as possible, So I learned how to use low f-stop numbers to open the aperture in the lens as wide as possible. Now opening the aperture wide had the added effect of creating a very short or shallow depth of field. So for example, the guitarist was in focus, but the background, the lights, the very unrock and roll pictures on the wall, even the drummer and the bass player were all blurry to a greater or lesser degree. Now this is really useful in portrait photography and in loads of other contexts, obviously, to bring the subject of the image to maximum definition and maximum attention. So I learned that the lower the f-stop number, the wider the aperture, the shallower or shorter the depth of field would be. And for landscapes, the general information around at the time was to get the longest depth of field, where everything from, say, the heather 5 feet in front of the camera to the mountains way off in the distance 4 miles away, was all in sharp focus. The aperture had to be as small as possible, so the highest f-stop number should be used. f22, f26, even f32, if your camera had that, were recommended. So when I dug out my old camera again this year and started getting properly into landscapes a few months ago, I was a bit surprised to find that the photographers I was watching on YouTube were recommending something a little bit different, or quite different indeed. These days it seems the recommended aperture settings for landscapes generally is somewhere in the mid-range, with f11 being probably the most commonly used, sometimes f8 or f9, occasionally depending on the scene maybe f13. Now I'm talking for the moment about shots with a wide or a medium angle lens, say 10 to 70 or 80 millimeters. Things can be slightly different if you're using a longer lens, but I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So why the change? Why was f11 not good enough for sharp images 15 years ago, but it's best now? And it seems there is a technical reason for why f11 works, which is that as the aperture on the camera gets smaller and smaller, at a certain point the light coming through the hole starts to diffract or bend, so it doesn't quite travel to the sensor in the straight lines that you would want it to, which can result in the image becoming slightly soft. Now I've no idea whether this was generally known when I had my first camera. I presume it was. It wasn't like it was back in the 19th century when I bought my first camera at the dawn of photographic technology. Now perhaps it was known, but the trade-off maybe between small aperture lens diffraction as opposed to the shallower depth of field offered by mid-range f-stops was different when film was still processed in chemical baths maybe. Maybe these days digital sensors and film scanners can develop more sharpness at f11 than used to be possible with chemical film processing. So maybe the trade-off is better now than it was then. I don't know, I really don't. But whatever the reason, things have now certainly changed. And it is certainly the case that I'm taking images that need long fields of focus and I'm seeing perfectly sharp images taken at f11 and thereabouts. Now I mentioned before that the situation regarding ideal aperture settings can be different if you're shooting with a long lens. Like, for example, if you're using a 200mm lens to zoom in on some moody cloud-enveloped mountaintops a couple of miles away. So because the nearest point of interest is already quite far away, the relative distance between the nearest point and the farthest point, starting from where you're standing, is shorter. So using an even smaller f-stop, like say f8 or even f5.6, can still give you results that are all sharp all the way through the image. Using a wider aperture that way in a long lens has the added advantage of allowing you to use a faster shutter speed, which helps reduce the risk of camera shake mostly, often a bigger problem with a longer lens, which is often heavier and might unbalance or blow around in the wind. So there it is. I'm not sure whether the difference is as noticeable at the kinds of resolution that most images are viewed at on YouTube or Facebook, or certainly Instagram on mobile phones, or even in print at the kind of sizes that most images would be printed at. But it's certainly the case that mid-range aperture settings give perfectly acceptably sharp results. One advantage, by the way, of using a tiny aperture at a high f-stop number is that it can give you, if you shoot a scene facing the sun, say at sunrise or sunset, health and safety warning, always be careful shooting into the sun for the sake of your eyes and your camera. The tiny aperture shooting into the sun can result in that starburst effect where you get the sunbeams out. Now, I find that effect to be a matter of taste, and it's not really to mine if I'm honest, but in the right place and used wisely, it can really add drama to an image. So don't entirely abandon those high f-stops. They do come in handy, but it seems it's just that we don't need them quite as much as we used to.